Good morning, or possibly good afternoon, wherever you are. Lots of people starting to come in, which is very nice to see. Yeah, we've already got 50 people straight in. Fantastic to see, really good. We've got a lot of people registered this morning, so a very warm welcome. Let's just give people a moment. Give people a moment to come on. And give Zoom a moment to catch up, I think actually is what we're doing right now. There we go, they're all coming in. Very nice to see everybody. John, we've got a lot of people here and a lot of people that you know as well, actually. We'll start to look at this in a minute. I mean, just looking down the people that we've got before we start formally. Buenos dias, señora Mita. Very nice to see you. Adham, very nice to see you, sir. Hello, Anna. I'm just starting at the A's here. Hello, Anna. Very nice to see. Dr. Rao, very nice to see you here too, sir. Very nice. Hello, Gogi. Very good to see you. Fantastic. We've got some lovely people here. We've got people from Georgia, people from India. I can see people from Armenia. Hello, people from, hey, Iro, very nice to see you. Hello, Jay. Very nice. Looking all the way down here. Hello, Narek. Narek's from Armenia. We've got some Armenians in the room as well. Fantastic to see. Nutsa's there. From Georgia, we've got Sridhar from India. Hey, Sudesh. Hello, Vila. Very nice to see you. Hello, Vaja. My goodness. Lots and lots of people. Just giving people a moment to join. We're a couple of minutes in. But I think what I will do is start us off, John. That's what I think I'll do. So, ladies and gentlemen, a very, very warm welcome to this webinar. We've got, as you can hear, as I'm seeing all these lovely people that we know, a lot of people registered for the webinar. We've got 20 people from 21 different countries registered. We've got people from everywhere from Tesco to Kuehne+Nagel, everywhere from 4 or 5 different universities in the UK, Essex, City, Bradford, Leicester, Cranfield. We have people from the Eliotamidi Foundation in Uzbekistan. We have people from Armenia, from Armenian universities, from Georgian universities. We have people from Nottingham Trent University. We also have people from Tata Steel. We have people from Satyam Venture in India. We have, I think it is something like 12 different ministries from the Egyptian government. Welcome everybody there. Very nice to see you. We have someone from the World Bank. We even have Ayel Ben Cohen, who is the Cranfield Entrepreneur of the Year, who's been building his company for 15 years. And is a fantastic entrepreneur and a great guy. So a very warm welcome to him. Really, really happy to see you all here. As we go through the webinar, you may have questions you want to ask. Now, I know that many people as of the last 3 or 4 weeks are becoming very, very familiar with Zoom. However, just in case, if you wiggle your mouse around a bit, depending on whether you are on Mac or on PC, you will see a chat window and you will see a Q&A window. Some people are already using them. I'm going to have to catch up. They will either appear on the bottom of your screen or at the top of your screen. And we're going to use both of those during this webinar. So chat window we're going to use, Q&A window we're going to use. I will keep an eye on both as we go through because we want to make this as interactive as possible. Those menus might be not obvious. They might be under the More section. There's also a little tab that says More. They might be there. Okay. So let me now introduce you to our webinar host today. I'm very, very happy that a man that many of you know, Dr. John Glen of the Cranfield School of Management, has agreed to do this webinar for us today. John is a fantastic hybrid of economist, consultant, and teacher. He was the director of my MBA at Cranfield and was also director of Cranfield's Centre for Customized Executive Development. He regularly comments, as many of you will know, on UK global and UK and global macroeconomics on BBC, radio, and TV. He's given more than 75 interviews in the last 3 years, and he is presently economist at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Neil. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see so many familiar names to the people at Cranfield, or people that we've worked with at Cranfield, and also people that you, Neil, and ChangeSchool have worked with over the last 3 or 4 years. So what I want to do now is to share my screen. I know 1 or 2 of you who know my reputation with technology will be worried at this point, but there we go. We seem to have got it up and running. And yeah, start to think about what it is that we want to examine today in terms of the economic impact of the coronavirus, but start to think about looking forward as we work our way through the pandemic, what that means for us as far as the economy is concerned, and perhaps more importantly, what it means for your businesses and how your businesses should be reacting to this, and the type of questions that you should be asking yourself in order to prepare to work your way through the pandemic, and then prepare yourself for some return to normality, whatever it is that looks like. So we're going to look at the economic impacts and strategies to deal with COVID-19, look at the policy response from a government perspective, and then this last point about the types of questions that your organisation needs to be asking. Okay. So the economic impact of COVID-19, I think most of us know that the economies that have been impacted by it, and the very few economies that haven't, are starting to post some pretty horrific numbers in terms of decline in output, increase in unemployment, the number of businesses that are coming under real financial strain, and the number of households that have seen their income drop significantly, and in some instances to zero, and a whole series of policies that have been enacted to try and deal with those issues. But the first thing that I want to look at now, because it's an issue that we're going to examine in this, is to have a quick poll of the 86 people who are on the call at the moment, to think, how long do we think it is in your economy, the economy that you're currently situated in as you listen to this webinar, how long do you think it will be before they get back to the levels of economic activity that you had in December 2019? Do you think it will be by December 2020, December 2021, or December 2022, or later than that? Neil, I think you can put a poll up now.
I can indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think? What's your first opinion? December 2020, December 21, December 22? The votes are coming in thick and fast here, John. It's actually quite an interesting race, but there is one race leader. It's like watching the Grand National going on here. We've got a very, very strong leader, I would suggest. There is a certain amount of prediction going on. We've had 63 of 88 voted so far. The last few, please give it a go. I'll give you another 5 seconds or so just to click whatever you think. What's your first thought? 2020, 2021, 2022, or even later? Right, here we go. I'm going to bring that to an end, John. So I'm going to end polling now, and I'm going to share the results. There you go. What do you think, John?
Okay, so most of us are thinking it will be December 2021 before we get back to the sort of levels of activity that we had in 2019. So essentially, it's going to take 2 years to recover, which is actually an exceptionally interesting result, given some of the analysis that we're going to look at the moment. Just to hold the idea that I'm going to say now that result correlates very closely with the view of the Nobel laureate Robert Shiller, who has actually said that one of the biggest issues that we will have recovering from this pandemic is the behavioral response to the pandemic. So how people will respond to their incomes being reduced, how people will respond to not only their own unemployment, but the unemployment of people around them, and also how businesses will respond to seeing significant reductions in their revenue in the short run, and their expectations about how those revenues will recover. So there are key issues, key assumptions that people are making in terms of how we're going to react. So the immediate effect of the virus is that people not unreasonably panic. So households panic because they see their incomes being reduced significantly. They see their employment prospects being reduced significantly. Businesses panic because their revenues in some instances go to zero if their businesses are closed down, or impacted significantly if their businesses are hit negatively by a slowdown in economic activity. This leads to uncertainty then and a drop in household spending and investment. In some instances, it will lead to bankruptcy. And in wealthy economies, what we have seen is governments coming in and attempting to provide finance to make sure that businesses don't run out of cash, so that those businesses are still in existence when there's some semblance of recovery from the pandemic. But at this point in time, I'm going to describe those businesses as zombie businesses. They're just about staying alive. There is a danger also that we see significant rises in unemployment, and I'll present you with figures that you've all seen. 20 million people in the United Kingdom, not in the United States, registering unemployed in the last month. And then there's a danger that we've not talked about, that we've not seen, is that if economies and households and businesses start to decline, businesses go bankrupt, households become unemployed, there's a danger that the crisis could spill over into the financial sector as businesses and households start to default on their loans and put pressure on our banking system. So that's kind of the challenge that we face. And also, the key point here is what I'm trying to make is that these economic realities will impact on people's behaviors. They'll impact on people's expectations. They'll impact on people's perception of what their economy, what their own personal economy and the broader economy is going to look like as we seek to recover from this crisis. So the economic outlook over the next 2 years cannot be divorced from the crisis. It cannot be divorced from the health crisis that we face. So many of our economies have shut down, have put strict controls on our movement and social isolation in order to flatten the curve in terms of the number of people being infected, and particularly the number of people needing intensive care, in order that our health services can cope. Mike Ryan, who's the guy that you see on the right there, the Irish doctor who's done a lot of press for the WHO, says the first stage is to flatten the curve. The second stage, and the one that we now need to start thinking about because it's going to influence the environment in which we as households exist and our businesses exist, is we then need to take the fight to the virus. So assume that a safe vaccine is a year away, then what we have to do is we have to stop a second wave, particularly in what we call the autumn or the fall in the Northern Hemisphere. So in September and October. A second wave will be disastrous, A, because of the human cost, but B, because the impact that it would have on our economies again. And in order to stop that second wave, we therefore need to take the fight to the virus. We need to test, we need to quarantine, we need tracking. We may have to have bio-passports with all the cultural implications for personal data that has. There'll still be an amount of social distancing, and we need to build herd immunity in a controlled manner. So the point that I'm making here is that these health realities will have an impact on the way that we can open our businesses up, will have an impact on the economy. And we're already seeing that sort of health imperatives versus the impact on the economy starting to clash, most obviously in North America, with people wanting to get back out onto the streets in an extreme way and protesting that they want to open the economy up. And then we see in Europe with economies, Norway, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Spain, trying to slowly open their economies up to get some semblance of economic recovery, but at the same time, make sure that we don't get the second wave. Okay, and then we get a whole set of data that economists are starting to produce. But I would say, and I can see some of you smiling as I say that, beware what it is that the economists are saying to you. This is stuff that is designed to help your thinking rather than to stop you thinking. So you must be skeptical when you read this economic analysis. So this is some stuff that's come out of the IMF last week, which is suggesting basically on the basis that, well, we had a pretty good economy, global economy in 2019. Fundamentally, there wasn't much wrong with it. We've had a pandemic. If we sort the pandemic out, then what's left underneath should be relatively good, and therefore we should recover relatively quickly. That assumes that we don't have a lot of unemployment in the intervening period. We don't have a lot of these zombie businesses that go bankrupt, and that we get a vaccine pretty quickly, and that we don't get a second wave. So the point that I'm making there is, what you need to look at when you're reading this stuff is you need to understand what the underlying economic assumptions are. This is some stuff that's come out of the United Kingdom, the ONS KPMG work, which is actually saying, if you look at the dotted line, they're kind of in line with what your polls suggested. We're sort of going out 5 quarters, 6 quarters, maybe a quicker recovery than you were suggesting. But again, there are some big assumptions being made here about vaccine. There are big assumptions being made about a lack of a second wave. Big assumptions being made about how much of our economy is actually in good shape when we get to the recovery. And the key issue there is, I can hear people saying, you know, from parts of the world where, you know, if you're in Egypt, you know, the Egyptian government has put forward a $6 billion package to try and support your economy through the crisis. Now, that's a big package for Egypt, but it's a small amount of money when you compare it to the 40 billion pounds that the UK government has put just to support household incomes. And there's lots of policies on top of that. So, you know, that there are many economies in the world who can't afford these policies to support household incomes and to support businesses through the crisis. And we have to then think about a global response to try and help these economies through that crisis. Now, again, I shall speak to that in a moment. You know, there are some economic realities that apply. The paradox of thrift was postulated, was put forward by John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s to deal with the depression then. And he said, basically, there's this relationship where when household incomes go down, when unemployment increases, households start to save. They become scared and they start to save. But of course, by saving, that means there's less demand in the economy and the recession gets deeper. So what we have to have is a situation where we get household incomes being sustained, household confidence recovering quickly, so this paradox of thrift is reversed. And again, the paradox of thrift also applies to businesses. Businesses rush to cash when there's a downturn. I always remember my professor in the early 1980s saying that in a recession, it's not the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the fattest. If you have cash, you survive. So what happens is we tend to hoard cash. But again, by hoarding cash, what happens is we drive our economies into further recession. And then there's the scary data that we're getting. I have to explain to people when I show this graph that the red line on the right-hand side of the graph is not the border of the graph. It's the massive increase in unemployment claims in the United States in the last 2 weeks of March. And we've seen that continued into the first 2 weeks of April, so that over the last 4 weeks, 20 million people in North America have registered jobless claims. Okay, so a massive increase in unemployment there. And then Robert Schiller's point is that pandemic fear could tip the economy into a depression, into a significant, what we might call U-shaped recovery. And this fear is not a criticism to say that there's fear. It's just Schiller saying that we have to be aware of the behavioral response. And what we have to do then is do as much as we can to sustain businesses, to sustain households, both on a national basis and on a global basis, to ensure that we all come out of this together. So the danger is that we do see significant unemployment in the next 6 months. And then the whole issue of vaccines and second waves becomes very, very critical. Okay, so now I want to go over to you guys, because now you're starting to, the questions that I'm getting asked in a lot of presentations that I do is, well, John, come on, get your crystal ball out and tell us which sectors of the economy are likely to recover fastest and which sectors are likely to recover slowest. And of course, the problem that I have is that, I'm not close to the business in the way that you are. So what I want you to do very quickly in the chat room, and we'll monitor these responses and try and report back to them report back on them at the end of the webinar, is looking at your own businesses. What lines of businesses do you think are going to recover the fastest, and what lines of businesses do you think are going to recover the slowest? So I don't know if Donal from BAT is on the call, but Donal, within BAT, you've got a conglomerate business. What lines of business do you see recovering quickly? And in fact, what lines of business may not have been impacted? What lines of business do you see being damaged over a relatively long period of time? And then for others, you might want to look at customer segments. So what segments of your market, if you want to think of it in that way, do you think will recover the quickest, and what do you think will recover the slowest? So Neil, I know you're monitoring that, and we'll see.
I am. So let's see, ladies and gentlemen. So what sector do you think? Put in what sector you think will recover fast. Maybe just put fast and then slow. Fast and whatever sector, line of business, customer segment, maybe from your point of view. Maybe we're all sitting there thinking it's mine. Oh my goodness, it's mine. No, maybe it's somebody else's. Or maybe it's a part of your business, or maybe just as a consumer. What are you looking around and seeing? It also might be different in different parts of the world. We've got Georgia, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Egypt, UK, the US. We've got all these, India, all these countries represented right now. An organization, Satyam Venture. So Dr. Rao, what do you think? Sridhar, what do you think? You've got a very interesting view because you work across all those different countries. Satyam Venture, for those of you that don't know them, work across China, Europe, the US, as well as India. So they'll have a very interesting point of view. And we've got all sorts of, we've got the answers starting to come through here, John. So just pick out a few, see what you think. So Anil, that's interesting. Housing sector is going to slow down, I reckon, because people are not going to be paying their rents, for example. Whereas Altaf reckons fast is going to be retail and technology. And Inas says ICT, of course, will recover and will boom. We've got supply chain, Sabine, FCMG, coming fast. We've got fast health-related businesses. Hello, Martine. Slow travel. Someone said fast retail. Someone said slow the high street, classroom-based. We've got food. Alex talking about the food industry being recovering fast. In fact, more profitable. That may just reflect your consumption habits, Alex. I don't know. The accommodation associated with students from Shirley is talking about that. Tourism sector will take some time to recover, according to Lana. IT will boost for sure. Energy will be very fast, according to Mohammed. Michael Haskins talking about travel industry, meaning aerospace will be slow until we have a vaccine. You mentioned before, did you not, about a vaccine? International students slow to recover. So it's quite a lot about students and people that there's a big theme here about tourism, travel, slow. Retail might be different from high street. So some people are saying retail fast, but then differentiating between the high street. Some people are saying slow. Maybe it's online retail that goes fast, or is it even carrying on? Sandy reckons higher education will move fast.
But the interesting thing there as well is that, what is it that's causing you to come to these views? So, what's driving your thinking? What are the economic drivers? What are the financial drivers? But also, what are the health drivers? So, when we're looking at the airline industry, we're looking at the fact that, first of all, are we going to be allowed to travel across borders? B, if we are allowed to travel across borders, do we have to have a bio passport? So do I have to prove that I've been tested? Okay, do I have to prove that I've had the coronavirus and I've got some immunity? Am I going to be allowed to travel on a plane? Can we practice social distancing on a train? Or am I going to be allowed, if I have to go to Stuttgart in September, am I not going to be allowed to fly, but am I going to be able to drive, go through the Channel Tunnel and then travel through France and into Germany? Okay, so how does that work? So all of these things we have to consider. And also, as we're bringing people back to work, how do we look after our own people and how do we protect them? So we've seen Ford, for example, looking at the development of bracelets where their workers get an alarm if they come within 2 meters of each other to warn them to keep their social distance. So all of these sort of considerations are things that we have to start thinking about. Neil, I'm going to press on because I'm cognizant of the time here.
Cool.
The next thing that we have to do is look, beware of the data, you know, so all of a sudden you're starting, you know, we've just done a quick search to see, you know, what sectors are going to be impacted. The stuff from the ONS that we got out of the Guardian, this is the United Kingdom, the stuff that KPMG have been producing, you know, saying hotels, restaurants, manufacturing, construction, some of the stuff you've talked about, retail are going to be down. But then you have to look at what it is that they're measuring. So on the right-hand side, they're measuring gross value added, which is a kind of really technical thing, you know. If we look at the inputs into the industry and the value of outputs from that industry, then that's going to be down 30% in hotels, as opposed to just gross output, which is what they're looking at on the left-hand panel here. But then education is down 90%. And we had a discussion about that. Well, 80% down, 90% down in Q2 this year. But most education establishments are still paying their people. They're still getting their income from students. Surely that's going to be an impact that's going to be had in the next academic year. And how will that impact universities that are postgraduate versus universities that have an undergraduate supply of students where, you know, their first years will become second years, their second years will become third years, you know, so there's still a flow of students coming through. And then to maybe one of the comments that was made in the chat room, maybe education will recover because it's able to take more of its services online. So again, when we're looking at retail, to what extent can retail recover if we now start to buy a lot more online, or if we do click and collect as we're doing in the United Kingdom? So how's it going to affect the patterns of consumption, and how can we react to that? So what's been the policy response then of our governments? And Neil, monitor this in case there are questions as we go through. One of the questions that we got asked prior to this is, you know, do we need a new Bretton Woods? For those of you who don't know, Bretton Woods was an agreement where 44 countries came together at Bretton Woods in 1944, before the Second World War had finished, led by John Maynard Keynes and Harvey Dexter White for the United States. And they developed the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which became the World Bank. They brought into being the International Monetary Fund. And both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were designed to provide liquidity, to provide funding in terms of crisis, in order to make sure that all economies recovered, because it was in the interest of all economies, including the wealthy economies, to make sure that that happened. So, I mean, you might think there's a degree of altruism here. There's a degree, it's not charitable. This is something that is in the interest of wealthy economies, to make sure that all economies recover. And again, if we come much closer in history to the financial crisis of 2008, G20, you know, you could argue that the influence of our then Prime Minister Gordon Brown, of President Obama, to have a collective response to the financial crisis in order that we try and reflate the global economy together and make sure that everybody recovers at a pace. We have a synchronized recovery rather than a recovery which is all about self-interest. And so it's really, really important that, you know, we make sure that a World Bank, an IMF approach, a European approach, an approach where China is providing liquidity, China is providing capability to allow economies to recover, versus, you know, a potentially sort of self-interest, maybe driven by electoral concern approach that President Trump appears to be taking in North America. So it's massively important that we have this global effort of recovery. It's the notion that we'll either win this battle against the virus together, or we'll lose it together. Don't know why we've repeated that. Then there was an argument about, you know, obviously coming from the Middle East, about governments' Sukuk to finance investment. So we've seen massive issue of Islamic finance in Dubai and Indonesia recently, over $1 billion, in order, in that instance, to support coronavirus related expenditure. But then this is a standard piece of government finance, particularly in the Middle East. So Qatar and Abu Dhabi have recently issued over $17 billion of this particular type of finance. The key issue for the recovery of the global economy is the extent to which that kind of finance goes into productive investments rather than into what you might call current expenditure, pandemic related expenditure. There is an issue, as there is always going to be, and you're going to see this argument exercised again and again and again around moral hazard. So, for example, we saw the Dutch government not being happy about issuing euro bonds, which would then be used to support the southern European economies of Greece, Italy, Spain and Portugal. But we have to get over this moral hazard. We have to make sure that people don't use the funds frivolously, and we have to make sure that they're, wherever possible, used in a way which sustains the productive investment of organizations. And remember, guys, this is stuff that you and your businesses do every day. Your businesses borrow all of the time to fund growth. And we have to make sure that our governments do that, and our governments, where they've got an ability to raise finance in international markets, do so. And then our financial sector has to step up to the plate. It's important that our financial sector assesses risks, make sure that money flows through the system to those people who can use it most effectively. What we cannot have is a situation which I would argue that we had post-2008, which is where our financial sector stopped taking risks rather than assessing risks. Yes, there are some dangerous investments to be made. Yes, there will be some investments that fail, but what we need our banks to do is to do what they're supposed to be there to do, which is to start taking risks. And it's interesting, in the United Kingdom, my namesake, John Glen, who's the finance minister, has said that, works in the finance ministry, has said that if the regular banks are not up to it, then we'll go to fintech. If fintech can get the money out the door quicker and can assess risk more effectively, then he's going to take steps to put the government funding, the government funds through those vehicles. So we need a poll now. So how effective is the support in your economy to keeping your business going? How effective do you think it is in the part of the world that you're coming from? Neil, do you want to put the poll up here?
Right. It's a very, very simple poll, ladies and gentlemen, to begin with. Because again, John, as you were saying, there's the policy, and then there's how can you apply it. So it's almost like you're pulling a lever that's made of rubber, where we're saying, banks, go lend stuff. And banks going, yeah, maybe not. Here's all this money available, but they're not lending. At least that's in the UK, right, at the moment, whereby banks are simply saying, no, they're not really going to lend all that much. So how effective is the support going to be? You've got policies, and then you've got the ability to implement those policies. You've got two different aspects of it there. What do you think, ladies and gentlemen? Give us some answers. We've got 50 odd people have already answered out of 100 that we've got on the webinar right now. Votes ticking up. While we're waiting, there's been started to get some quite nuanced chats around, for example, universities who are losing income overnight from accommodation, and they've got great they've got a lot of possibility in the local sector for example, the UK universities have got a lot of students in the UK, but international students aren't going to come. There's some quite nuanced things going on in the chat window. We've also got things about the finance sector, to expect a lot of bankruptcies in the insurance sector, for example. Right. And I'm just going to give you another 5 seconds, ladies and gentlemen. This is an interesting result, John. What do you think of this?
Wow.
And Nick.
Okay, that's 50. And it's interesting. Obviously, we have, because of the spectrum of economies that we're dealing with here, we have economies that can afford to do this sort of support, and economies that are going to find it much more difficult to be able to afford to do this kind of support. But also we have economies that are at different stages of that support process. So, at the minute we have, in the United Kingdom, in terms of maintaining household incomes, literally yesterday we started to provide funding for what we call furloughing. So the government will pay 80% of people's wages up to £2,500 per month, which is incredibly generous, in my humble opinion. And the money seems to be flowing. So, but how will that change as we go through the policy, and it becomes much more difficult to sustain the policy? And we also see some of the funding for businesses not actually getting out the door. So that'll be an interesting one. It's a kind of poll that you should almost be taking on a weekly basis to try and get a feel for what's actually happening, and also to go back to the points that we're just making, to start to inform the policymakers about the extent to which their policy is actually, the rubber's hitting the road in terms of having the impact that it needs to have in the time scale that it needs to have this impact. Because we've got businesses out there, we've got households out there. When I talk about zombie businesses and zombie households, we've got businesses that can't afford to have, 5 or 6 weeks of zero or close to zero incoming cash flow. The businesses just collapse. So if you're going to provide support, you've got to provide it relatively quickly, or else the patient is going to be in dreadful state by the time you get to them. Okay, and then I start to think, some of the questions that you're now thinking about, what's going to happen in education in terms of new students turning up, in terms of international students, in terms of the massive infrastructure that we've invested in for student accommodation. Okay, so now we've got to start thinking about what the world is going to look like as we come out of this pandemic, and how our business models and how we need to change to meet the challenges. So what is it that we're going to do about this? What are the questions that I need to start asking of my business? So here, really, what we can't do is, or what would be incredibly arrogant of somebody like myself to do, would be to sit down and say, well, all you need to do is A, B, C, and D. What I actually think we need to do is start thinking about, what's the quality of the discussion? What's the quality of the analysis? Who's actually doing the thinking inside our business? And who are we getting involved in those conversations to make sure that we actually start asking some good questions and start to think about, how we're going to meet some of these challenges.
Well, so before you move on, John, on, go back to that question for me for a second. Go back to the slide, right? So before we do move on, we've got a lot of experts in the room. We've got 101 highly educated and very professional business people in the room. What do you think, ladies and gentlemen? Here you are in this situation. You've got policy response that you're seeing around you, some of which is working, some of which isn't, some of which is being implemented and some of which isn't. You've got a virus that's going around the world, that's a global issue, that's out of sync across different parts of the world. You've all been being impacted, as we've seen already by what you've said. You've all been impacted in different ways and are concerned about different parts of the economy. What are your thoughts? From where you're sat, from the business that you're looking at, what do you think you can do about all of this from where you are? Any thoughts in the chat window at all? What do you think? What are the problems you're facing? And what can you do about them? Because then what we can do is I can put them to John and we can see what's going on.
Okay.
From where you're sat, what do you think are the issues that you're going to face? And what do you think you're going to be able to do about them? Any thoughts at all? Oh, there's the first one, right? Figure out how you keep revenues coming in, howsoever small it will be. Yeah. Something about assessing the risk from Yosra, trying to do some damage control. Things coming in here as well. There's something about the fear there'll be a double hit on disposable income, but both the fear that you were talking about, John, around the Keynes point, and then the recovery and wanting to build resilience. So there's something that might mean that things will extend into the future. Here's an interesting one. Figure out how you, from Rajan, how you intervene in the free market by keeping people employed when the economy reopens. How do you intervene in a market that's free? Shirley talking about needing to avoid knee-jerk reactions, doing scenario planning, ensuring you respond to need. Michael talking about, can we diversify? Maybe there's a response to the situation around. Sandy talking about spreading the pain across the workforce. Lana, Lana's worrying about her scholarship, achieving scholarship. So there's all things going on here. Heber's talking about embracing the current situation, but looking for new ways to keep the business running. Shirley focusing on supporting economic and social stability and growth. Altaf looking at a big surge in demand and sales, but fragile supply chains. Something about supply chains, John, which I think you were going to think about earlier. We've got all coming through the Q&A window. We've got things like the issues around diverging strategies from Canada and the US, from Nick. And how do you manage divergent strategies by governments in countries with heavy dependencies on mutual exports? Different things happening either side of the supply chain.
Yeah, so I mean, they kind of divide in terms of, you know, bigger, broader macro issues and you know, what's going to drive the environment in which we have to operate, and then the response of the individual organisation. So to what extent, you know, have you got your ear to the ground in terms of, you know, if we're looking at potential sources of revenue, you know, what is it that your customers want? How can you help solve the problems that your customers have got in this instance? And you know, how do we start to drive those revenues? But then looking at our operating models and, you know, what can we actually do to our operating models to make sure that we are as lean as we can possibly be, that we are as efficient as we can possibly be, that we can make changes that maybe we've been looking at making in the past, but now we have to make them a lot quicker. And where do we get this information from? So there's this notion, you know, who's going to tell us about our operating models? Who's going to tell us about what our customers want? And very often we exclude people from the conversation who know the most about it. So we fill the room with what I would call hippos, the highest paid people in the organization, who in many instances are a million miles away from the operational realities of the business, or a million miles away from day-to-day interaction with customers. So we need to get those people who are really at the interface of the business model and the challenges that we face, really at the interface of, you know, the organization that we work for and the customers that we have to serve, and ask them what it is that we need to do, and then feed that in and make sure that we have this sort of, you know, Linda Hill has got a great TED talk, which I would invite you all to go and look at, which is on innovation, but she talks about creative abrasion. We have to have abrasive, robust discussions inside our organization with the right people in the room in order that we develop ideas as quickly as we possibly can. And then we have to have what she calls creative agility. So we have to experiment. We have to get minimum viable offerings out there very, very quickly. But we can't go into, I saw this wonderful phrase the other day in an article that I was reading, we can't go into what this guy called piloting purgatory, which is we go into endless hours and endless months of piloting an idea. The world just is moving at a pace now, which that's not acceptable. So you've got to have the agility to come up with ideas and then get them out there, test, learn, and go through the cycle again. Mike Ryan, you know, going back to the guy at the WHO, said that we can't allow perfection to be the enemy of action, of actually getting involved and doing stuff. And I think that's really important in terms of what it is that you need to do. So we need to act quickly on the basis of the best information that's available to us, on the basis of the best informed people inside our organization, and make things happen as quickly as they possibly can. And again, the great thing about a crisis is that, you know, and I've said this to many of you who've listened to me talk before, the great thing about a crisis is we get permission to do stuff that we wouldn't normally get permission to do in the normal sort of state of events. So we will be able to get on and get stuff done very, very quickly. And it's important that we do that.
Yeah, indeed, Sir John. And actually, a lot of what you've been saying is reflected in what people have been typing as well. So we've got people talking about doing things in a different way. Like you said, it's a good excuse to do so now. It's that the pressure is only in things that have been waiting for 10 years to happen, now happening in 10 days. And we've also got we've got some themes coming up, which actually quite handily matches what I know you've got coming up. A lot of people are talking about supply chains. A lot of people are talking about resilience. A lot of people are talking about how do you get to your customers. And how do you get to the market? Because there's going to be a change in demand. There's going to be right now there's a fall in demand. We know that, but then the nature of that demand will change, and they need to look at that as well. So maybe it's time to move on from this one and start to talk about the three sort of sections you've got coming up.
Yeah. So look, there were three areas, guys, that we sort of collected our ideas in, and again, it reflects the type of questions that we were asked before this webinar. First of all, in terms of your people. Basically, at the moment, we're in the middle of a massive social experiment, and real-time research has been undertaken about, you know, people working remotely. Now, at this point, I promise you that I'm not up in my own university, Cranfield, but the wonderful Professor Claire Kelleher has been working on this for 10, 15 years. And those of you who know Claire's work will know that she's had done an enormous amount of research into remote learning. and the impact on people's well-being and the psychological and mental well-being working at home. Claire's research shows that people historically who've been allowed to work remotely have tended to work excessive hours, in some instances as a kind of repaying their employer for the sort of trust that they've shown in them. And also this notion that technology, as many of us have now found out, tethers us to our desks. What does that mean? It means that we're sat at our desks, maybe not the prettiest view, at 6:30 in the morning, working because we can. We can come out of the back of our houses. I have a 10-meter commute to work. I can be working at 6:30, and I can still be in my office working at 11 o'clock at night. So we have to watch excessive work hours. We also have to then take the work that Claire and people like Claire have done and said, well, you know, that was remote working in a context that's not similar to the one that we're in now. So how do the old patterns that Claire has identified actually translate to what we're seeing now? And again, Claire is involved in real-time research to try and look at that, and many of the people that she works with. And then we have to look at this whole social aspect of work. So how does it impact creativity, innovation, and productivity? Will we ever get people back into the office? I've spoken to one or two HR directors who are actually really worried about the fact that how am I going to get people back to work? You know, if you're in London or in any of the major cities in the world that we're talking to today, people have typically got an hour and a half's commute to and from work. So you've now given them 3 hours a day, 21 hours a week back into their life. Why would they want to give it back to you? And then the last point, and it kind of relates a little bit to some of the comments that people were making about student accommodation. What are we going to do with all this real estate that we've invested in that maybe we don't need anymore? And I think that's an interesting question that many organizations are going to have to look at as an outcome of this whole people issue. Then in terms of supply chain.
Before you go on, John, so let's look at that, because we've got people talking about things like the need for increasing behavioral adaptability and being able to improvise. So as things change and move quickly, as the phases change in the following months, and yet you've got people that are disconnected from each other more than they were.
Yeah.
You've got lots of the informal channels of communication, the old coffee machine or water cooler conversation that people talk about. It's not happening.
Yeah, and then in reality, the extent to which that can be done via social media, via Zoom. So we've all become Zoom addicts, Microsoft, whatever their offering is, addicts. We're all on Instagram, WhatsApp, WeChat, whatever your version of it is, whatever part of the world. Now, to what extent does that actually replace what you're calling the water cooler conversation? You know, so is it more effective? You know, the way that me and you work, Neil, you know, we're on WhatsApp. We can, you know, send each other a quick meeting. We can go on, we can download and work on documents together via Dropbox or whatever we're using. Is that more productive than, you know, somebody coming and sitting on the edge of your desk and talking about football for half an hour? You know, so yeah, the jury's out here. It really is. And that's why, you know, I started that people thing with, we are in a massive social experiment, you know, and we need to think about how we can make sure that, you know, some of the great things that we did when we could meet face to face, you know, can we replicate them asynchronatically? Can we replicate them at distance, or do we have to create opportunities for people to come together for certain activities? These are all big questions that our organizations have to ask, and by the way, have to come up with some answers in pretty short order. Okay, you know, we've got to get on with answering this pretty quickly. One other, well, a couple of other aspects have come up, one of which is someone saying, well, what about your furloughed workers? You're not in touch with them. How do you get in touch with furloughed workers? Because, well, are you allowed to, on the grounds that, you know, that they're supposedly not at work, you know? So what is it that you're allowed to do? What is it that you're not allowed to do? And again, within that regulation, you know, what can you do that's positive? Indeed. Okay. we're looking at the supply chain issues then, so some of the stuff now I'm sort of, this initial stuff is what we're hearing at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply in terms of what procurement people are working on. So are we getting onshoring? So we're bringing back our supply chain into our own economies, and is the capability to supply there? And what does that mean for our logistics providers who maybe have been bringing stuff in from China or bringing stuff in from Europe or the Middle East? And now we're going to bring that back into the UK or to North America. We've seen President Trump announcing overnight that he's going to close the borders, and it's all part of protecting US jobs. Are we going to get more insourcing? So outsourcing of activities. Now business is going to say, no, well, the crisis has shown that this actual process or this service is critical to my business. So I'm now going to bring it back inside my business. And then nearshoring, where we actually, we don't want to get the stuff from China, but we'll get it from Europe. We don't want to get it from Latin America, but we might get it from North Africa. So how's that going to affect the pattern of trade? And I know there are one or two people from logistics providers here. The KN guys, the Kuehne Nagel guys are on. So how does that affect the pattern of global trade, and how does that change how you service your customers, and how does it impact the mode of transport that you use? So you've got to work out what it means for you. You've got to talk to your customers, despite what I just said. For an old guy like me, email and WhatsApp doesn't count as talking. You literally got to get out there and pick the phone up and talk to these people. And by the way, in the environment that we're in at the moment, people actually, I think, respect that. Then mapping your supply chain is going to be a big thing. If you're talking about supply chain resilience, we do some stuff with an outfit called Risk Methods in Germany, where essentially what they will do is they'll use artificial intelligence, machine learning, data analytics to provide you with a digital overview of your supply chain. And then they will tell you before the market tells you if there's a breakdown in that supply chain and where you can get alternative suppliers. So this sort of Industry 4.0 methodology to risk is something which I would think you'll see accelerated. I know that DHL has got the Resilience 360. And just to keep the Kuehne Nagel guys happy, I found out yesterday that you are also working on a tool. So this whole digital mapping of your supply chain is going to become the required standard. And it's something that if you're in a large organization and you haven't got it, you're basically using risk methods which belong in the last century. And you've got to make sure that you up your game. I've talked about revisiting our operating model and what does that mean for our supply chain and our supplier relationships and our logistics capability. And then in order to do all of this and to be aware of what's going on, you've got to get people who are closest to the operating model, who are closest to the customer into the discussion and avoid this hippo problem that I talked about before. And then the third area that we wanted to talk to you about, and this is the big question that everybody's asking, what is the nature of demand going to be for universities, for BAT, for Kuehne Nagel, for government after we come out of this? So trivial things, will people socialize at home? What's the impact on bars and restaurants? Will we go kind of party crazy as people did in the 1920s after the First World War and the Spanish flu pandemic? Digital services to support shopping, working from home. How important is the digital divide going to be in so providing low cost, high quality access to digital services in emerging economies, and how that is going to be accelerated as a result of what we see. There are going to be new economic patterns that exist between customers and suppliers, between businesses and their supply chain, and all of these have to be mapped out and have to be thought about. And these are the questions that you have to be asking yourself inside your business at the moment. And literally people have to be preparing in rapid time for what they think is going to happen. There'll be a change in nature of regulation. So if we've seen, Formula One in the United Kingdom has helped with CPAP, so providing oxygen regulating mechanisms for people in intensive care. But we did that in 3 days. over one weekend, we took some old technology, we stripped it down into a minimum viable product, we got it regulated, and we got it in the hospital. So regulation and the nature of regulation is going to change, and regulation, slowing businesses down. I talked to a student who said, can we not go back to the regulatory environment that we had 30 years ago, where things were regulated much, much lighter, and we got things done much quicker? Okay, well, if that's the case, there are risks involved with that, but it allows our businesses to work quicker. What about the regulation of data? Am I prepared to put an app on my phone that allows people to know where I've been, if I've had the virus, have I been in contact with people who've got the virus, and what are the implications for me and for the security of my data? What about product design and regulatory approval time for that? There are definitely going to be big decisions at a global level about the divide between rich and poor in terms of health outcomes and in terms of patterns of work in our own economies. And then the whole piece that I talked about, the nature of travel documentation, monitoring health, and do I have a digital imprint of my health, which I then have to present as I cross borders if I want to do so in the next 6 to 12 months. So these are all issues that we need to be considering. Okay.
Well, so actually, while you've been talking, John, that's very interesting, because we've got people talking about things like the communications piece you were talking about. So Colin Pink's listening is asynchronous communication, so it really needs a video or voice rather than text. Yeah. And essential part of problem solving, collaboration, and team dynamics. That's all across the piece. So whether that be your supply chain, whether that be your customers, whether that be your people that you work with.
But Neil, on the collaboration and team dynamics, I agree 100%. And frankly, it would be really difficult to disagree with that. But then I beg you, go look at the Linda Hill thing and see what that team dynamics and collaboration actually means. So, creative abrasion. We have to get people who can go into a room without fear or favor and say what they think about the issue that we're discussing, and irrespective of where they are in the organization in terms of seniority, in order that we get, Linda Hill talks about everybody being able to contribute their slice of genius to the conversation. And I think we have to get into that culture of working very, very quickly, and then take those ideas and action them very quickly. The Mike Ryan bit, don't let perfection be the enemy of action.
Indeed. There's also interesting things here about moving into the psychology of it. How do you build trust? If you haven't actually met someone, it's harder to do. And there's something about psychological safety, about being alone. So there's some interesting, there's someone saying here, Colin again, saying there would be a greater gap between the transactional physical roles and the knowledge economy.
Yeah.
Some of us going out, some of us staying home.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you wouldn't expect any less of Colin, to be honest, but these are kind of like, the quality of the questions that we have to be asking, and then, the people that we have to get into the room to inform the answers. And again, just as a trivial example, but to try and drive the point home, we were on a, whatever it is, FaceTime talk the other evening with a friend of ours. She's in her early 50s, a nurse who runs an end-of-life care hospice in Manchester. And she was saying, I've got my staff working remotely, and I'm really worried about their mental health. And the other thing is that their psychology is different from my psychology. That their behavioral responses are not the same as mine. And therefore, if I don't allow that kind of information into the room to inform my thinking, if I think that everybody looks like me, that everybody behaves like me, that everybody's the same as my particular cohort of the population, of a particular age, of a particular experience, then the danger is we're going to make some really bad decisions about how people react to these different environments that we put them in. And that whole thing about, psychological safety, the whole thing about, people's well-being and mental health, is something that we have to address, and we have to exhibit a degree of leadership which has an amount of humility in terms of our own ability to understand the challenges that people face, and a willingness to have a broad church of opinions being brought to the table before we decide how it is that we're going to progress.
Really interesting. So I guess there's a little bit of going back to our audience now, isn't there, John?
There absolutely is. So, I mean, what we'd like to see is what are the questions that you're considering? And also, you know, particularly in order to try and inform our thinking going forward, you know, what are the issues that we haven't addressed that you would have thought, yeah, I really would have liked you to have talked about that. So if there are some of those that we could maybe speak to in the few minutes that's available to us before the end, and if not, we can either respond to you offline or maybe think about future webinars.
Yeah. So what do you think, ladies and gentlemen? What else? Because we've got ourselves another 10 minutes or so. What are the questions that you are thinking about right now? What are things that you're facing? That's interesting. Something here about the ability of startups to make inroads on the market. What happens when the money runs out? Just read a few out as they come in, and then let's see where we go. What, in terms of government support, what happens if the money runs out? We've got current business leadership and corporates was too slow to adapt to the new reality. A key outcome would be the need for greater levels of diversity to reduce groupthink, more rigorous reward systems that look beyond softer measures of success. How do I keep my daughter's education undisrupted? It's a very, very fair question. Motivating employees working remotely. And I guess that even broadens out, doesn't it, to the employees that we were going to bring on, but now we can't until we know what's going on. The employees that are furloughed, there's a whole big piece there.
Right, I'll take a couple of those. So first of all, with startups, yeah, so for example, if you take my example of financial services, obviously, occasionally these crises are really good for accelerating the opportunities that are available to them. So, you know, fintech banking, online banking is going to get a boost because they're seen as potentially a way of resolving the problem. If we look at, you know, we've worked with Credit Kudos, who are a credit rating agency. They're looking at broader ways of assessing risk in terms of credit risk. You know, they will be brought in to help to be part of the solution. And also startups then have to think about, we've been doing a lot of work at ChangeSchool, or Neil's been doing a lot of work with the ChangeSchool team around startups as part of the Royal Academy program. And we're now looking at how you can actually pivot your technology, reframe the sort of questions or problems that you're going to answer for your customer, and then refocus your efforts. And we saw some great examples in the work that we've been doing over the last few weeks of how those technologies could be applied to the current crisis, but then could be applied to the nature of demand that we see existing after the crisis. In terms of diversity and groupthink, all that I can say is I agree 100%. Go watch the Linda Hill TED Talk. It talks to exactly that point. The reward system one is interesting because we don't have to worry about rewarding people at the moment because they're in a crisis and people are worried about their job, and fear tends to promote a certain amount of performance. But what we do have to think about is, you know, how do we, I don't think monitoring performance is the issue here, because if Claire Keller is right, people tend to work very, very hard. But how do we reward people for the contribution that they make? It's quite interesting, you know, there are, you know, you can't help but suggest, you know, as you monitor social media yourself, there are some people who are exceptionally good at telling you what they've done, irrespective of how spectacular what they've done is on social media. And then there are some people who just get on with doing it. And again, you know, how do we reward people in that context is interesting. And then as far as educating your daughter, well, I speak as the father of 2 teachers and the husband of another. And it was interesting, there was a teacher who was on the television the other day who said, you know, her genius, her magic was educating your children. So just make sure that your children's enjoyment of education and zest to learn is maintained, don't worry about what you're teaching them. Just keep them interested in learning, and any catching up that has to be done, the teachers will sort out in September when they get back to work, because that's their magic power. And I think that was quite a nice way of putting it. So, you know, if you can, you know, create a desire to learn, create a, you know, curiosity in your children, make them want to go out, you know, and talk about whatever it is that you're seeing, or whatever it is you're doing around the house. I think that's a big piece of the whole education bit. Help them enjoy it. And then, by the way, start to value teachers a little bit more when you send them back to school. I think one television presenter said recently that teachers should be paid £500,000 a year, and that was after 1 week of lockdown.
Right, indeed, and I think that the pressure's being felt in many homes across the country in that one. So there's a couple of other things just to spend a minute or two on before we start to bring it to a close. There's a lot of questions coming through about communications, connections, psychological safety. There's a lot of questions coming in about the effect of people at home. I'm just wondering, John, so can I ask everybody, would it be helpful, by the way, just in the side, Keith Hoodless has said that what you were saying about teachers is why he's still listening to his lecturer 30 years down the line.
Yeah. Thank you, Keith, for reminding me how really old I am. Yeah.
Very nice.
Lovely to see you, Keith.
So there's a question here, ladies and gentlemen, because if we did something on that piece, we could do another webinar. We'll probably do it next week. You can get an expert into Colin Pink saying, yeah, ditto, 17 years, a little bit better. So if we did,
it only seems like yesterday, Colin, but there we go.
So if we did another one on this piece about that psychological safety, about how we keep people in touch, about how we keep our furloughed workers in touch, about how we grab hold of our customers when we don't have the normal communication methods, would that be something? Just say yes or no on the chat. Would that be something people would be interested in? Because I could get someone in to talk about that. Oh, lordy, yes. Okay, Michael, Masra, Alex, Tiggy, Anil, Rajan, Mohammed, Vile, Mahesh. Right, okay, I think the answer is yes. Isabel, they're all saying yes. Fantastic. Right, we'll organize something. Irina, fantastic. Right. So what we'll do is I will get ourselves an expert in these things, which I know a very, very good one about this communication piece, and I'll organise something for next week. In fact, so I know Laura's on the call. Laura, I'm going to ask you to set up a webinar same time next week with expert around this communications piece, and we will put the link, ladies and gentlemen, to that webinar in the follow-up email from Zoom, so you can all see it. And fantastic, thank you, Colin. And we can all look at that. What I've also got for you, John, here is I've got the results of that fast and slow. We've put them into a word cloud.
Fantastic.
Let me grab the share from you for a second. So I'm doing a little bit of Zoom gymnastics here, ladies and gentlemen.
Do I have to stop?
No, I can grab it from you, I think. He says. Yeah, there we go. There you go. So the left-hand side is fast, if you can see that. And the right-hand side is slow. So going back to what we were saying about which of the sectors that we think are going to recover quickly and which are going to recover slowly. So it's a little bit of a word cloud from what people said on the left-hand side.
It's right. On the slow one, a lot of that is around the ability to move internationally. And even in some instances, the ability to move inside your own economy. So it's that notion of how quickly can we facilitate movement. And then the quick stuff, yeah, it's interesting because, again, I was doing some work with Kay and guys yesterday, and what we're actually seeing is there's a big issue about masses of stuff arriving from China into UK ports in the next week or so that's been ordered, but obviously UK businesses aren't open. So it's going to arrive on the port side. What are you going to do with it? And how do we use that stuff? So you're kind of seeing that supply chain opening up, but then you've got this asynchronous recovery. China's in business, but we're actually not in business. And again, it goes back to that point that we need to recover quickly. ICT, obviously a no-brainer. Yeah, pharma in there. Construction's an interesting one, because construction, on the one hand, we can keep building the stuff, but are people going to buy it? So, civil engineering, where we're doing big construction work, maybe. My brother's a house builder. I think he's still building houses. I'm not so sure people are buying them. So that's an interesting one.
Interesting.
Yeah, really cool. Yeah,
very nice.
That. Big time.
Lovely. Right, ladies and gentlemen, so we are coming to the end. It's 10 past. We're due to finish at 15 past. One more, because there's an interesting one from Altaf, John, for you, just at the end. How do you see China emerging from this? And how do we globally have to see this, and how should we react to it?
So China, what you're actually seeing there is, first of all, it will experience negative economic growth for the first time, that most of us can actually remember, when it was meaningful to measure their economic output in the kind of way that we do in the West. They'll recover. Two things I think are important. First of all is the extent to which China plays its role in providing global liquidity. So China, those of you in Africa might know that China has been really good at providing liquidity for the development of Africa. China also seems to be willing to play its role in making sure that all economies recover together, because frankly, it's in the interest of China to do that. But, it's been a good global citizen. And against that, there's then the geopolitical thing around, the trade wars with North America, the clash with President Bush, the finger pointing around, who's responsible for the coronavirus. So I think there's that kind of spat that will go on the side. And what we kind of have to hope is the sort of Chinese pragmatism, which is about, doing things that are good going forward, sort of overcomes any of that kind of nonsense that's going on the sideline. So I think China's going to be an important economic driver of the recovery in terms of its activity and its consumption. And I think it's also going to be an economic driver in terms of leading this kind of coordinated global response to making sure that as many economies recover as they possibly can. And then, of course, and we discussed last night, Neil, the advantage you've got with China is that whereas the sort of Bretton Woods, World Bank, IMF response tended to impose what became known as a Washington consensus on how economies that received that support ran their economies, the Chinese have a much more what you might call laissez-faire approach. They'll provide you with the funding. Yes, they expect to get some soft power benefits from it, but they're not going to tell you how to run your economy. So it'll be a really interesting sort of geopolitical sort of global recovery, and the role of China in it will be something that people will study for many, many years.
Indeed, indeed. Right, John, thank you. So, I mean, we're almost at time here, so I'm going to bring us just to a close, ladies and gentlemen. As I bring us to a close, what I'm also going to do, if I may, before you run away, is put a quick poll up to give us some feedback. There are 3 questions. If you scroll down very quickly, just 1 to 10, on giving us some feedback on how well this worked for you, just so we can learn a little bit as well, which should be lovely. So I'm going to bring it to a close, but ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Firstly, John, let me start with John. John, thank you very much for all the time and effort you've put into designing and delivering this webinar. We've done a few together over the last few weeks. They've all been different, they've all been fascinating, and they've all been very, very engaging, and people have really joined in, and that's a testament to your expertise and capability, so thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to the webinar today. We're very grateful you've attended, and I hope you've had as a fantastic time as we have. The webinar will be available as a recording, as will the slides. The links will be sent out in an email tomorrow to all of you that came. Also there, we will have a link to the webinar that we've talked about for next week, and where we'll be talking about things like how you engage your customers, how you engage your employees, whether it be for your university, how you might engage your students, given that the normal communications processes aren't there for you. So in this more distributed situation that we're in. So we'll do that for you as well. It's been lovely to see you, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of people from more than 20 countries in the world. Thank you very much for coming, and have a very good, whether it be morning, afternoon, or evening, or wherever you are. Bye now.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Look after yourself.